Hi U.S. history students, welcome in. So we're going to do lesson 8.7 today. This lesson is about the final conclusion of World War II and the immediate pivot or the immediate transition into the Cold War. So I'm sitting here, it's a Monday morning as I'm teaching this. My audience is two cats that are asleep, which reminds me of a couple of you students. Anyway, I'm not going to name names here. So I'm going to go ahead and do this lesson. It's another one of these where it is just a shame that I'm not with you. I love to present these ideas to students and see you play with them in real time. So we're going to I'll have to hear your responses at a different point. Okay, so last time we talked about the war in Europe concluding. At that same time, things are winding down in the Pacific. All right. So in spring 1945, the island hopping campaign has been successful to the point where now the U.S. is able to unleash bombing raids on Japan with very little Japanese resistance at this stage. You can see this image here of like Tokyo being firebombed, sort of traditional conventional bombs. The city of Tokyo suffered miserably during this time. As you can see, over 100,000 were killed in these attacks. But if anybody had hope that like just sort of conventional bombings like this were going to force a Japanese surrender, they really hadn't been paying attention to how the island hopping campaigns had been working, of course. Now, around the same time, spring 1945 is when Harry Truman becomes president. And like I mentioned last time, Harry Truman was more or less kind of left in the dark during his couple months as vice president. Once he becomes president, like a folder is placed on his desk, figuratively speaking, and some people sit him down and say, you should know about this. And this is when he's informed of the so-called Manhattan Project, right? This project that had been a top secret military operation of the United States to make reality a theoretical kind of weapon that we know as an atomic bomb. Now this project has its roots going back to Albert Einstein alerting the United States to the possibility of this back in the late 1930s and saying Hitler's aware of the possibility of this, and you better believe the Nazis are trying to create one of these weapons, and so it is in the world's interest that the United States beat him to this. This sort of finally kind of comes online here at the very, very end of the war, and Truman is told we have 3 of these built, and the 3 that were built, one has been tested, and it was a successful test. Like, it works. It's bad. It works. And so Harry Truman we said last time, he's known for this sort of blunt, decisive style, and here he's sort of like given this ultimate moral decision, and it's placed in front of him. Now, in classic Harry Truman style, he's going to say for the rest of his life, this wasn't really a hard decision for me. I mean, here are his words. Truman said, I asked General Marshall what it would cost in lives to land in Japan. It was his opinion that 250,000 casualties would be the minimum cost. Let's stop here for a second. So he's saying, I asked my top military brass if we did an invasion of Japan, like we've been doing for Peleliu and Iwo Jima and these other places, sort of D-Day style invasion of Japan, what will be the cost in lives? And he says, and the top brass say, at minimum, 250,000 American lives will be lost. At maximum, we're looking at over 1 million. Truman says, I asked Secretary Stimson what cities in Japan were devoted exclusively to war production. He named Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We sent an ultimatum to Japan. It was ignored. I ordered atomic bombs dropped in the 2 cities. Dropping the bombs ended the war, saved lives, and gave the free nations a chance to face the facts. Now, before he's used the weapon, scientists, including some scientists who were working on the Manhattan Project, wrote to President Truman and said, please don't use this. Right? We helped design it and build it. Please don't use this. On that petition, the scientists wrote, we, the undersigned scientists, believe that the United States ought not resort to the use of atomic bombs in the present phase of the war, at least not unless Japan is given an opportunity to surrender. A nation which sets the precedent of using these newly liberated forces of nature for the purposes of destruction may have to bear the responsibility of opening the door to an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. They're saying This is an entirely new category of weapon and an entirely different moral calculus. And if we are the ones who, blow the door open to this, so to speak, we bear some of the weight for that. Please don't do this unless it's totally necessary. Now, the question of the ultimatum, let me just specify very, very quickly here. The United States was saying, to Japan, you must surrender without any qualifications, right? Like unconditional surrender. We will dictate the terms of what will happen to Japan. And up to this point, Japan had not offered that, an unconditional surrender. It was surrenders ifs and surrenders buts and surrenders whens. And the United States is saying, surrender or the war carries on. When they didn't surrender, on August 6, 1945, Harry Truman authorizes the use of the first of the 2 remaining bombs. On Hiroshima, 60,000 people died within minutes. Many tens of thousands of them died instantaneously from the force and more frequently from the heat. Just sort of the weight of the blast went straight down, which is why you can see this. It's just sort of like the city is pulverized in the epicenter. Several days pass, right? The clique of Japanese military leaders is like chickens with their heads cut off, just like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Russia enters the war because Russia's like, hey, we'll declare war in the Pacific here and we'll get in on this and maybe we can sort of scoop some chips up at the end. All right. And so now Russia's entering the war. Japan still isn't surrendering. And so Truman authorizes use of the 3rd and final bomb in Nagasaki. 35,000 more were killed. And of course, the death toll would rise by many tens of thousands, over the years due to radiation effects and all this sort of stuff. Finally, after the second bomb is dropped, Japan, of course, doesn't know that we don't sort of have more and more and more of these. The clique of military leaders goes to their figurehead emperor and says, what do we do? And Emperor Hirohito says, we surrender. And that is the end of the war. Now, like if you can see the close-up in this image on this American newspaper, it says, Pearl Harbor is avenged. Now, I'd say this is avenged many, many times over, of course. I mean, the deaths at Pearl Harbor are, 2,900. And in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we're talking many times that. And when you look at specifically the casualties in the Pacific, similar to what we did last time, when we talk about trying to feel the weight of this, things we'll note, sort of as Russia bore the heaviest cost of the war in Europe, China bore the heaviest cost of the war in East Asia. And that has a lot to do with Japan's invasion of China in the 1930s. It also has to do with China's having its own kind of internal civil war between nationalists and communists that the communists will eventually win, of course, but this is not a happy period in Chinese history. We can see the sort of cluster in the middle of the Pacific, all those cluster of Japanese flags just means like the Japanese deaths during this island hopping campaign. We can see, similar to Europe, that relatively speaking, American costs were somewhat smaller, although still significant. And this number at the bottom, I confess, is kind of gobbledygook. 60 million died in World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history. I can't really feel the weight of that. I think it's easiest for me to just sort of make this category in my brain of World War II was the worst thing that's ever happened. All right? That's really it. Did good come out of it? Yes. Was it a necessary war? I really would argue yes. All right? There was evil and injustice that had to be addressed, but the costs were something just difficult to get our heads around. Sadly for the world will not get a respite. The world doesn't get a rest and like an easing into a period of relative peace and calm. Instead, what we have is this sort of immediate transition. It's like the dust is sort of still settling all over the place. And what sort of the new reality that becomes clear is there's really only 2 nations left standing here. The old powers are gone. The old powers are utterly spent at this stage. And the United States is left standing, and Russia, the Soviet Union, is left standing. And if we're clear, Russia's got a bit more of a bloody nose at this stage, and it's a little more bruised and battered than the United States. But there's basically 2 superpowers left standing. Because the United States and Soviet Union have such different worldviews and priorities and ways of thinking, and even sort of conceptions of what the good life is, these two are going to immediately enter into this period of high tension. Not outright combat, thank God, because that would have meant, at a certain stage, literally it would have meant the end of planet Earth, but it would have, instead, this sort of longer, complex, but also kind of stomach-turning period called the Cold War, right? 45-year period of high tension between economic superpowers. It's a period of tension in which the other nations on Earth are sort of like at a tennis match, you're sort of like looking at the United States and Soviet Union sort of ping-pong this conflict back and forth, and the other nations of the world are told, basically, pick sides. Whose side are you on in this? And so the world will kind of align itself largely between these two poles. This is the moment where the United States, because it feels like it must, because the consequences are too horrifying to consider, the United States expands its geopolitical and economic influence around the world, right, as a way to slow the spread and slow the influence of this competing power. Now, my plan for teaching you guys the Cold War is this. In our remaining short time in this lesson, I just want to give you guys the basic contours of what this was. And then next time, in our next lesson, the last lesson for Unit 8, I'm going to give us some specific episodes in the Cold War that we can look at that fit under this umbrella. The core question is, how do you have a peaceful and just world? Right? What is the path to peace? World War II seemed to teach Americans and people around the world this lesson that the path to peace does not come from disarming ourselves. For a long time, people had sort of looked to idealistic ways to sort of achieve a more just and peaceful world. In the wake of World War II, it's sort of like the scales fall from people's eyes, and they say, if you want to have peace in the world, and if you want to have, if you want to protect justice in the world, then you need to first arm yourselves and be ready to fight to defend peace and defend the causes of justice. Right? Because if you disarm yourselves, what we saw is people like Hitler or Mussolini or Tojo in Japan are just going to say, cool, more for me. Cool, they're afraid. Cool, like we can take more stuff now. That just sort of seeds the whole playing field to bad actors in the world. The message is, if you want a more peaceful and more just world, a way to that path is definitely not the old American plug our ears and close our eyes and just ignore it. Right? Just listen to the radio and watch Charlie Chaplin movies and just sort of like get in our own little world and ignore the problems of the world, because the lessons seem to be we ignored those problems in the world, and then we saw smoke and we're like, ooh, that's bad. And then we saw it getting closer and closer and closer and closer and closer until it nearly swallowed us up. We would have been much better off to take a much more proactive role in the world. So Americans are seeing their role in the world very differently as a result of World War II. And Americans weren't seeing this necessarily as, here's our chance to sort of dominate the world. They were seeing it as this, like, if we have any hope and desire for like a stable world, right? A world where there is more peace than war, a world where there is more justice than injustice, that involves our involvement, right? And the United States' role in the world changed right there, permanently. Right? Or at least it hasn't changed since then. There's Americans today who are like, why are we so involved here? Why are we so in that? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? And I'd say the answer is right here in lessons 8.7 and 8.8. So listen up. I like this slide here just because, we're going to finish here. This is like a basic overview of this 45-year period. What was the Cold War? And I tried to kind of get it all, distill it all together here. The Cold War is a conflict primarily between the Soviet Union and the United States. Although, of course, the Soviet Union has a bunch of other smaller nations aligned behind it, and the United States has other smaller nations aligned behind it. People in contemporary America say, man, we just got caught up in the boogeyman, the communist boogeyman, or like, why are we so afraid of communism? And part of the answer is because communists announced their intention to like spread communist revolutions and totalitarianism around the world. That was like their stated intention. And the United States said, this is bad. All right, it's bad to do that. It's bad to take people's freedoms and liberties away. The greatest, most precious thing that we can have are our freedoms and our liberties to pursue happiness as we see fit. This conflict plays out in a number of different ways. That's where I put the modes of the conflict. Like one way it plays out, we'll look at next time, is this arms race, this escalation of like who's got the most weapons. And this starts getting really scary once we're looking at atomic and nuclear weapons, and now we can blow up planet Earth, and like, that's getting a little hairy. We'll look at that next time. It is an ideological competition. All right, it's two sides trying to sort of argue whose way of life is better, right? The communist system, where it's like, we will, through government control, we will create a classless egalitarian system where all things are shared and we are finally equal, or the American system that's going to prioritize capitalism and capitalist choices, and to another smaller extent, democracy, where people get the freedoms and they get the liberty to choose a way of life of their own choosing. There is like massive levels of spying between the two sides. We form this institution called the CIA. The Soviet Union has the KGB. There's like massive infiltration of each system by the other side and spying on one another. We never go to war directly against the Soviet Union, but the United States would find itself in wars in Korea, wars in Vietnam. In those cases, you are fighting proxies, right? It's like, by fighting Vietnam, we're not fighting the Soviet Union or Communist China directly. We're fighting smaller proxies or stand-ins for them, and the Soviet Union would do likewise. And sometimes during the Cold War, you would find yourselves, because the nations of the world are sort of told to pick sides, sometimes you look at your own side and your own friends and you see nations that were, or governments that were maybe not so cool, right? Or governments that were maybe not so enlightened, like Argentina's government or Iran's government in those days, and you'd say, well, we know they do bad stuff and we know they're not that cool, but they're on our side in the struggle against the encroachment of communism around the world, and so you kind of prop up those governments, or you help out those unsympathetic governments. This is not always a great look for the United States, and this adds an element of moral ambiguity that we will see in that story. And one thing I just want to leave us with, it's nice in 2020, I can sit here and tell you the story of World War II and the start of the Cold War, and I can make it fit sort of narrative patterns in a sense, and make it seem like chapters in a book, and where we know where the story's going to go. But I'll tell you, that's not what it was like to live in it. For people who lived through it, this was extremely cloudy. Like, where are we going? And are we in a period of perpetual, like, horrible conflict around the world? And we're in something like that right now, where we don't know what the end of the story is. We're in a cloudy moment. And so what is really useful to me is just, like in this bottom right-hand corner, to just recognize that our story is nested within larger stories. And yes, our focus generally is in the American story. And in Unit 8, the neat part is the American story is a central part of the history of the human race, right? The human story. But all of this is nested within God's story. And in moments where our story is cloudy, or we're unsure of where it goes, there is peace and there is clarity and there is meaning in looking for the markers of God's story, looking for the markers of creation, of how things ought to be, of what God intended for us, understanding the markers of the world's fallenness and how things are not as God intended them to be, right? God's redemption, which we just celebrated at Easter, and which World War II illustrates our desperate, desperate need for, right? Like God, Jesus on the cross, it's useful to me to think, as silly as this might sound to you, I don't know, it's useful to me that Jesus on the cross knew about the Holocaust, right? Like he knew some of these things, and this is in part what he's dying for. And restoration, this work of like the work that we pick up alongside God, like the little kid shovel in the driveway with God, right? The work we do alongside him in restoring things. And sometimes it's useful to just look for those markers, like looking for those signs in the sky. And I want to encourage you that for Americans in 1944, 45, 46, it was cloudy and they didn't know where this went. All right, we can step back and fit the Cold War and the end of World War II into these chapters, but it's hard at the moment. In 2020, we're in sort of the same spot. All right, that's okay. When in doubt, look for those signs of God's story at work in the world and in our own lives or in our own homes. I'm going to leave you guys with that. I look forward to our next lesson of talking more about the Cold War. But until then, you guys have a great day. See ya.